In the spring of 2004, I took a flight from the airport in Greenville, South Carolina to New York's LaGuardia. I was going to visit my step-grandmother, a woman I had become close to over the years. She was dying of cancer, and this would be one of the last chances I would have to see her. I had taken a weekend flight as I had several times before in order to have a couple of days to spend with her in her apartment in the Bronx. For several minutes of that flight, however, it was not her death that concerned me, but my own. The approach to LaGuardia's runway usually goes from east to west. When we fly up from South Carolina, the plane veers right over Brooklyn and Queens, then turns back around to the left towards Manhattan and makes its descent. From the left side of the plane where I usually sat, one could see the Manhattan skyline as one turned towards Brooklyn. On this particular day, that is exactly what happened, until we were about to land. Then the plane began ascending once again, heading towards Manhattan. There was no announcement from the flight deck, but it was clear we were going to Midtown. I could see the Empire State Building in front of us, a bit to the left, as we headed towards the Empire State Building. The cabin became very quiet. At first, people were asking their neighbors what was happening. Then conversation petered out altogether. From where I sat, the plane clearly seemed to be heading for the Empire State Building. It was an eerie moment. I remember seeing the building from an odd angle. The top was straight ahead of me. I could see the sky beyond it, and to my left was downtown. I almost felt as though I could look into the windows and see people at work. In a way, all this angered me. In a way, all this angered me. I grew up in New York and have always loved the Empire State Building. I had never had the same feeling about the Twin Towers, which I guess this dates me a bit, seemed to me a bit pretentious. The Twin Towers seemed to me a bit pretentious. The newcomers who lauded it over the more venerable building on 34th Street. This might seem to be an odd thought to have at this moment, but as people often say, time seemed to slow down. My thoughts first went into business mode. I recalled that I had told my wife Kathleen where all the important papers were and tried to remember where I had them all up to date. I asked myself what was my last interaction with each of my three children and was relieved that it was a positive one. I had hugged each of my kids and told them I was looking forward to seeing them. I noticed that my stomach was in a knot and that my fingers were cold. I looked out of the window and I saw the Empire State Building closer. I figured that I was going to die. There was no we for me at that moment. And then I realized something that has never left me. I realized that I had not regretted my life. There had been disappointments. I had lived in South Carolina for many years than I had planned to, much more years than I had wanted to. I hadn't had as much contact with my friends as I would have liked, and I've had not visited very often this city that I had grown up in and was about to die in. But I also knew at that moment that I would not have traded this life I had lived for another one. I would not have worked harder to get a more prestigious job at the expense of being able to spend time with my kids, or have a spontaneous breakfast with my wife here and there, or on a hard Saturday workout that left me spent for the rest of the day. The life I had lived was not the one I would have chosen if I had been asked at some point early in my studies or my careers. But having lived it, I would not have traded it one for another one. Of course, I didn't die that day. The plane gained enough altitude to pass over the Empire State Building, but not by much, it seemed to me. As it turns out, when we were about to land, a smaller plane decided it would be a neat idea to land at LaGuardia at that same moment, and our pilot had to make a quick move. He was concentrating on navigating us safely through airspace that since 9/11 had become fraught. So he didn't have time to announce what was happening until after it was over. Although I would have liked to know what was going on, I took this to be an exercise in good judgment on his part. And in the end, it gave me a chance to reflect on my life in a way with an urgency that I would probably not otherwise have done. You'll not be surprised that I have not forgotten that day. At least some of you who read these words will have had an experience like it, when you knew you were going to die but had time to ponder what it all meant. And I've carried lessons from that day. I keep in mind what emerged as important in those seeming last moments and try to cultivate it. And I try, with more or less success, to keep perspective on the rest. It might also seem that the fact of death, the fact that I'm mortal, turned out to be a good thing on that day. After all, if I was immortal, I would neither have a, I would never, I would neither have had a chance to reflect on my life nor known what it meant to me to have lived this particular life. None of that would have mattered. Whatever mistakes I had made, there would have been all the time in the world to correct them. Well, assuming that everyone I cared about was also immortal, and whatever joys I had had, they would have lost a bit of their luster with my knowing that I might experience those same joys an infinity of times again. But there is another side to that coin. I might have died. Planes, as we learned, do crash into buildings, and if I had died, this is to say, if I had not been immortal, I would have seen my wife or my children again. I would not have felt the righteous lassitude that comes with hard workout, or the fascination of a new idea garnered from a book of philosophy. Those joys which meant so much, which gave me the life I realized I did not regret, would be over. To see both these sides of death is, I believe, to begin to reflect on it. Death is tragic, arbitrary, and meaningless. At the same time it can, because of the particular way it is tragic, arbitrary, and meaningless, open out onto a fullness of life that would not exist without it. What we shall investigate in this book, looking periodically at what philosophers and writers have said about death, is the role that death plays in our lives, as well as ways we try to escape its power, and what might happen to us or for us if we can face it squarely. I would like to make a bold claim right here at the outset. The fact that we die is the most important fact about us. There is nothing that has more weight in our lives. This doesn't mean, of course, that there aren't other important facts about us. Human beings love, work, have sex, create friendships, embark on lifelong projects, undergo intense emotions, even watch others die. These are not insignificant. A life without at least some of these things would probably not be one worth living, at least to the person living it. Maybe it would have been worth living in the eyes of others, for example, one's parents. For most of us, there is not one particular fact about us that is the only important fact. That too is not the only important fact about us, but it is the most important one. Why is this? Because it is the end of every other fact about us. It is the end of our friendships, our projects, every one of our involvements in the world. Although death is not the only important fact about us, it has the capacity, in a way no other aspect of us does, to absorb every other fact, to bring every other aspect of our lives under its sway. One might say that a great love will do the same thing. A love that becomes the focus of one's life seems to center the world on the person loved. What matters is only to be with the beloved. Nothing else seems of account. The joy or sadness of one's own life seems to hinge on small gestures of the one loved. A smile or an arched eyebrow take on outside significance. And one's own ultimate happiness is hitched to the happiness of the other. Many of us have at least had moments like these, small periods of great love. It is difficult to sustain such a love over a lifetime, but even if it could be done, even if it has been done, it is still not as absorbing as death. Even when love is at its peak, we still eat and we can enjoy the taste of food. It may taste better in the presence of the beloved, but its taste will, at least sometimes, not go unnoticed. We will read the newspaper or at least check out the news on the internet. There will be events we will read about that move us one way or another: a war, a massacre, starvation. Even in love, we are not immune to revulsion at these things. Even small joys, such as one's sports team winning a game, register a tick on one's emotional Geiger counter. Except perhaps for fans like me of the New York Knicks who wait in vain for such ticks. Nothing like this happens with death. Nothing escapes it. It encompasses us without remainder. And not only does it encompass, bringing everything about us within its cortex, but it then negates everything it encompasses. A great love can make us see different aspects of our world through the lens of that love. The world remains there for us, but it looks different in all of its aspects from which it would look like otherwise. In death, the world is no longer there. It doesn't look different, it disappears. I taught a seminar on death once to a group of upper level undergraduate students. The first day, I asked them to put their books aside and take out a piece of paper and a pencil. Then I asked them to write 4 or 5 of the most important things in their lives on the pieces of paper and fold it up. I promised them not I promised them that nobody would see what they had written. When they were done, I asked them to pass the papers to me, folded over so that they couldn't be seen. I assured them that I wasn't interested in what they had written. What mattered was that each of them knew what he or she had on the paper, that what each of them had written was before their minds. When they had all passed the papers to me, I gathered them in a small pile. I asked them to focus on the paper and on what they had written. Then I took the pile and slowly tore it into little shreds. Then that, I told them, is what each of us needed to confront. This is what we had to understand as best we could. That is what makes death the most important fact about us: its ability to negate every other element of our lives. And there is more. There is another aspect of death, one that we will revisit later, but is worth bringing into discussion now. In order to see death's ongoing significance in our life, to see it, let's start with a counterfactual example. Let's suppose, contrary to the way things really are, the death was something of which we were unaware until it happened. It would be as though death were a bolt from the blue. We lived our lives, engaged in our various commitments and involvements, and then one day we just stopped living. It's a difficult world to imagine, since we would have to account for how we notice other people no longer living without our wondering what that might have do what that might have to do with us. But let's suppose we could do it. Would that change anything about the role death plays in our lives? If we had no awareness of it, would it remain the most important fact about us? It would still, to be sure. To be sure, be the negation of our world. It would still, to be sure, be the negation of our world. But it would seem to play less of a role in our ongoing lives. We would die, but the fact that we were going to die would not have a hold on us. We would not be gripped by it. We would go about our lives as though we would live forever. Or at least not considering that we wouldn't, since with that out of the picture, we would also probably not think much about living forever. It would just be natural. We would be living, and that would be that. Until, of course, it stopped. But of course, things aren't like that. We are not unaware of death. It is always there with us. It may not be present to little children, but it surely is present to grown ups. My oldest son recently learned to drive, and my wife and I have done our level best to instill the fact of death in his consciousness. As we grow older, see people disappear from our lives, or face situations where we fear our own lives are at stake, the recognition of death is always there. This is not to say that we always meditate on it. In fact, and we'll return to this soon, we usually try to escape thinking about it. Even in escaping it, however, it is with us. It is with us because we are trying to escape it. It may be that humans are the only animals with an ongoing sense of their own death. I don't know. Surely many animals have some awareness of their death, especially when it seems imminent. Animals will cower in fear or lash out aggressively. Keeping oneself alive seems to be a mandate in the animal world, one that is wired in, which is not to say that there aren't individual animals, human and otherwise, that lose the will to live, but these are the exceptional cases. To seek to remain alive when one's life is threatened, however, is not the same as having an ongoing awareness of one's death. It is more like the counterfactual case I just described, with the addition of an alarm of some kind going off when the death is in the neighborhood. In order for death to be with us in the way that it is, there has to be more than an awareness of one's demise in the face of a threat. There has to be some higher level awareness. In particular, there needs to be a recognition of one's life as having a trajectory. There is a beginning, an end, and the period in between. There also has to be, we will revisit this point many times, a recognition that death could happen at any time. One is mortal, not only at the end of one's life, but all throughout it. Without the awareness of the trajectory of one's life and its ongoing vulnerability to death, death would have a less significant role to play in one's life. Are these animals that have the capacity for higher level conception of their lives and the role death of their lives and the role that death plays? It seems difficult to say. Given evolutionary history, there are surely intermediate stages between complete unawareness and full human recognition. How that more or less murky awareness works is difficult to sort out. But that humans, with our advanced capacity for memory, reflection, and projection into the future, that we are attached at every moment to the fact of our death cannot be denied. We can seek to elude it, but it remains with us. As animals who are aware of where our lives are headed and that we may not get there, our death is always with us. We humans then are the creatures that are characterized, first and foremost, by the fact that we die. I've said this is the most important fact about us, but some may want to deny this. They may want to say that we are talking at too abstract level. By the term abstract here, I don't mean difficult or complicated. I mean instead that abstracted from the specifics of people life. It may be easy to argue at the level of generality where we are talking at here that death is the most important fact about us. But it could well be that death, while in some sense the most important fact about human being, is not necessarily the most important fact about each of us. It could be that there are particular lives that have more important facts about them than that they are going to die. It could even be that many particular lives are that way. Here's an example. A family undergoes the death of a child. It happens a lot, particularly in places where there aren't enough resources to keep the population going. Let's imagine the case in a little more detail. A child has a debilitating disease, one that resists medical treatment. His or her health slowly disintegrates in front of the family's eyes. They have to endure this. The parents, in particular, have to watch helplessly as the child moves inevitably towards death. Wouldn't this fact be as important, more important to the lives of the parents than their own dying? Wouldn't their own deaths pale in comparison? In coming to terms with this example, we cannot take the easy way out. We cannot say that this example also involves death, so it has some similarity to the issue of death as we are posing it. It doesn't. As we have been speaking of death, it is not the death of someone else that is the fundamental fact of one's life. It is one's own death. As the philosopher Martin Heidegger reminds us, the salient fact about death is that it is for each of us my own death. We can hear about the death of others, go to funerals, even see someone die. These are weighty matters. However, they do not replace the singularity of one's own death. It is not that one's own death matters more in the grand scheme of things than the death of someone else. It is that one's own death cannot be understood by coming to terms with someone else's death. The silencing of one's experience, including the experience of the silencing of another's experience, remains intimately one's own in a way that cannot be understood by analogy with anyone or anything else. This returns us to the question, then, of how to think about death of one's child. I've said that death is the most important fact about us as humans. Couldn't it be, though, that some traumatic event, or perhaps some glorious event, although this would be harder to imagine, would be more important to a particular life than the fact of one's own death? Could it be that in light of this traumatic event, death loses its power? The end of our experience then becomes something less to be dreaded and maybe even welcomed. There are two responses to be given to an example like this. The first is easier and more straightforwardly philosophical. It may seem like a way of dodging the example, but it reminds us of something central to who we are. This response is to say that death is the most important fact about us as human beings. As particular humans, our individual trajectories may differ. Some of us have difficult lives that may not even appear to us to be worth living. In 1988, I met someone in a refugee camp in Gazatrib. He was 17. He told me that he had confronted his father once, demanding to know why he would bring him into such a world. For others of us, I suspect most the difficulties of life do not override its meaningfulness. But what we as human beings have in common is a death whose inevitability is coupled with uncertainty. A death that will end our experience and can do so at any time. Moreover, this inevitability and this uncertainty are aspects of death that we cannot escape. We are ultimately creatures who are aware of the end that awaits us. And finally, that awareness structures the way we go about our lives, even perhaps especially when we act as though we were never going to die. Even if this is right, it doesn't seem to answer the question of whether, in cases like our example, death is a more important fact in particular lives than some other event or fact about those lives. In order to address that question more directly, I want to distinguish two different questions. These questions are both centered on the importance of facts about one's life, but unfold in two different ways. The first question is what makes a life meaningful or worthwhile, or on the contrary, saps life of meaning. The second question is what is the most important fact about a life, the one that structures it more than any other? The importance of traumatic event lies in their role in addressing the first question. The importance of death has to do with the second. Things can happen, good or bad, that lend life meaning or that steal it away. When each of us looks back on our lives, he or she will ask about those things. They will involve projects we have undertaken, relationships we have cultivated, and events that have occurred. For some of us, one hopes very few among those events will be the death of the child. That death will be a defining event for the life that had to face it. It will make that life seem less worthwhile to the one who has lived it. It will be part of the content of one's life that will probably be reflected on as one asks about the meaningfulness of that life. The importance of death lies elsewhere. It lies not in the content of one's life, in one's personal trajectory. Rather, it lies in the way it structures how we go about our lives. And it does so in a way that is perhaps more important than any other fact about us. We live life always in the shadow of the fact that we will die. What we do, how we do it, the attitude we take towards it happens against the background knowledge that each of us is mortal. Once again, this does not mean that everything in a life is reducible to death. There are many important facts about human lives. Rather, it means that among those important facts, our mortality holds a special place. It even structures a relation to a child's death. The meaningfulness of a parent's life is, as for all humans, the meaningfulness of a mortal life. The parent will reflect on the child's life and death and the place it has in his or her life from the perspective of someone who will themselves die. Everything would be different, as we shall see in the next chapter. If the parent were immortal, but parents are not immortal. Everything will be different, as we shall see in the next chapter, if the parents were immortal. But the parents are not immortal, and their approach to the child's death will be structured by that fact. You might put the point this way. There are projects, relationships, and events that are the what's of our life, of every life. Death is one of those whats, but its operation is as a how. When it becomes a what, when it happens, there are no more hows to a life. But before it happens, it operates on life as a how, the most important how of which a human life is composed. I have offered a few reasons to think that death is the most important fact about us, and have tried to show, at least initially, the way in which it is important. The evidence for death's central place in life is everywhere around us. In order to see it, let's take an example. Let's take as an example an arena of life that is centrally important for much of the world's population: religion. Among the roles of religion, it is to deal with death. Among the roles of religion is to deal with death. It is an important role. And the way most religions deal with death is by offering the solace of a way to continue life. For me, one of the urgent aspects of thinking about death is that I don't believe in an afterlife. Therefore, I need to come to grips with my life in its brevity and its finality, a finality that was particularly clear to me on the plane that day in 2004. Most religions recognize that people face death, and they recognize that understanding or somehow coming to terms with it is of central importance to people. However, rather than confronting death as an end, a number of religious traditions think of death differently, as something other than an end. Of course, most religions don't claim we don't die, but there is, for many religions, a particular sense in which we don't really die. We don't die in the sense that there is no more of us after we are dead. In order to see how this works and how death is central to many traditions of religious experience, let's take a couple of examples. In taking these examples, we should at once recognize that religious traditions are rich and varied. The reasons I have chosen the examples I have is that they represent common approaches to particular religious traditions. Many people will recognize themselves in them, although others of the same faith will not. The obvious place to look is at the monotheistic religious tradition. Take a standard view of Christianity. When you die, you are assigned to heaven or hell, or in some cases, purgatory, based on the life you have lived. Not all of you arrives at one of these destinations. Your body is left behind. It is your soul that faces judgment and therefore the result of that judgment. It is sent to one place or another depending on how it has conducted itself during your earthly existence. This is what is meant by an afterlife. I want to call attention to one particular aspect of this story. In having an afterlife, you survive your own death. It's not just the survival that is the point here, it's also that is you that survives it. The you that exists after you die is, in some sense, the same you that existed during your life. Logically, it must be. Otherwise, the judgment on your soul would be pointless. Why would someone other than you be judged for what you did? No, it is you who is judged, and you who is consigned to heaven or hell. This also means that the you is consigned must be the same you who is judged. Again, it wouldn't make any sense to judge someone and then give the reward or punishment for that judgment to someone else, or to create someone else to be the recipient of it. If that happened, it wouldn't really be a reward or punishment. It would be like a judge passing a sentence on a criminal and then sending someone else to jail, or making up somebody to send to jail. The point of rewards and punishments is precisely that they are meted out to the person who has earned them. If we think of heaven and hell as reward and punishment respectively, and it's hard to imagine how else we are to think of them, then they must be assigned to those who have been judged deserving of them. The upshot of this is that there is a continuity between three stages of our existence. The first stage is your existence here on this earth, your life in the mundane sense. The second is your existence after you die, but before you are judged. The third is your existence after you are judged. These three stages, in order for the common Christian doctrine of the afterlife to make sense, must all be stages of your existence. Stages of your existence. It must be you at every point in this process. It doesn't have to be all of you. Your body doesn't stay with you in the last two stages, but it must be the core of you, the essence of who you are. That's what your soul is, the essence of who you are. In the Christian tradition, your body is mostly a vehicle for your soul, although it does have particular weaknesses towards sin to which a bodiless soul would not be subject. The fact that it is you who remains in these three stages is, of course, both the promise and fear associated with the Christian afterlife. The possibility that you will exist in eternal bliss is a possibility that is a source of hope only if it is you who will do so. By the same token, eternal damnation is not a source of threat or a motivation to act well, unless it is you who will be facing the torments. But there is something else, something beneath the promise and fear. That is, I believe, a source of comfort in the afterlife in this conception of it. That something else is simply your continuity. That something else is simply your continuity. Whether you spend your eternity in heaven or hell, whether you are blessed or damned, you will still exist. You, the essence of you, will not die. There will be no total negation of your experience in the way we described a few pages ago. One might ask, and it is a good question, what of your experience will remain? Will all your memories survive in the later two stages? This seems unlikely, since many of them don't even survive during the first stage. But something of your memories must survive in order for you to remain who you are. It's hard to imagine how it could be you who is judged if there is no past you carry with you. In addition, what aspects of your way of being will remain after your corporeal death? Corporeal death. It's hard to say, although, as with memories, there must be enough of them, or at least the most important aspects, to make you who you are. Something of your intellect must survive, your emotional orientation, your interpersonal style must be subject to judgment and to the results of that judgment. What the specifics are may be hard to say, but one thing is certain: whatever it is of your experience that survives it, it must lie at your core. It must be deeply a matter of who you are. And that is the source of comfort a conception of the that is the source of comfort a conception of the afterlife brings. One may fear the ceaseless agony of an eternal afterlife in hell, but one is at least assured that there will be a life, one's own life, the core of who one is. One's joys may end, but one's life will not. And so a conception of afterlife brings with it some comfort. No matter how fearsome its consequences may be, there are also, of course, mechanisms in most Christian denominations to allow one to avoid the worst case scenario. But even on that scenario, one thing will not be lost: oneself. The thing that death threatens to take away will remain more or less intact. When we see this, we also see how central this idea of the integrity of oneself after death is to this common experience of Christianity. Without this conception of the afterlife, one that retains each individual soul, Christianity would become a very different religion from the one that it is. Once again, not all Christian denominations require the belief in an afterlife, although that is the usual approach. Others, many of whom take the New Testament in a more literary sense, interpret discussions of an afterlife more metaphorically. However, it is not only Christianity that keeps death at bay in this particular way. Much of Judaism and Islam do as well. Moreover, so do Eastern religions. Buddhism, the most popular of Eastern religions, is a case in point. Buddhism emphasizes the withdrawal of attachment from things of this world. It seeks the extirpation of desire. Desire is what leads to suffering, both of oneself and of others. Human beings desire things: material success, recognition, comfort, love, and so on. The problem is that no amount of any of these things will slake desire. Desire just transfers its want to something else or something more. By allowing ourselves to be subject to our desire, we are eternally unsatisfied. We can never be at peace as long as we desire. We will always suffer. Desire leads not only to our suffering but to the suffering of others as well. It is through desire that we compete with others. We want what they have, that we compare ourselves to them, and ultimately that we are willing to harm them. Without desire, one would have no reason to treat others badly. However, desire is difficult to extinguish. As a result, many of us wind up suffering and bringing suffering to others. This is where the doctrine of karma becomes important. I should note here that there are different ways to interpret the doctrine of karma. One way, although it is much less popular, is to interpret it as the unending carousel of desire that one must step off in order to achieve peace. On this interpretation, the Buddhist wheel of samsara refers to the unending slaking and return of desire. One desires has that desire met or not met, and then moves on to the next desire, always unsatisfied. This way of interpreting karma does not engage the issue of death. The other interpretation of karma is the one most people are familiar with. It requires reincarnation. On this interpretation, the wheel of samsara refers to cycles of life and rebirth that one undergoes until one achieves nirvana. That is, an existence void of desire. Roughly, the idea is this: to the extent that one is directed by desire, one will suffer and bring suffering to others. When one dies, one is reborn in a higher or lower form, depending on how much one has allowed one's life to be so directed. Less desire allows one to reborn into a higher life. More desire directs one downward. Karma refers to what one has done in one's life. It is not merely descriptive, though, it has a normative status. We could say that one's karma is both the sum total of a particular life and the grade that life has earned on the scale of eliminating desire and its effects. Thus, one's karma situates one relative to the next life. One's karma situates one relative to the next life. The question for us is what is it that is reborn? As with the type of Christianity we discussed above, your body does not stay with you after death. When you are reborn, it is into a different body. It is your mind or your soul, again as in Christianity, that is reborn. If your karma consists in what you have made of yourself in a particular life, your rebirth situates you in a particular karmic state in your next one. Your karmic state is not your faith. If it were, everyone would be reborn as the same thing he or she was in the previous life. In Buddhism, one chooses to work on oneself or chooses not to. That determines how one will reborn, at least until one achieves nirvana, when one will not be reborn at all. At that point, one steps off the wheel of samsara. At that point, one steps off the wheel of samsara. So who you are evolves either upward or downward, depending on how you go about your life. This is in contrast to Christianity. In Christianity, as in Judaism and Islam, you have only one temporal life. The judgment on your soul happens once. In Buddhism, as in Hinduism, each life is judged, depositing you in the next life in a form that matches the karma of your previous one. We might put things this way: in the Judeo-Christian tradition, earthly life is a test for the afterlife. In Buddhism, earthly life is a problem to be overcome. While in the Judeo-Christian tradition, the desire associated with temporal life must be mastered in order to be worthy of heaven, in Buddhism, the desire associated with temporal life must be mastered in order to avoid more temporal life. For Buddhists, life is suffering. Overcoming life is then the goal. Does this mean that the Buddhist relation to death as an end is different from the Christian one we discussed earlier? In one way, there is something more dynamic about the Buddhist conception of who one is in relation to death. While for Christians, there is only one earthly death. For Buddhists, there are many. And, and who one is in the face of a particular death may be different from who one was in the face of an earlier death, and who one might be when confronted with a future death. In Christianity, there is a strict continuity between you who lives on earth, the you who's judged, and the you who follows the judgment. Buddhists, however, see the possibility of developing different yous with different karma in each life. Does this alter the essential question of whether you survive your death? The answer here is no. The dynamism of Buddhist reincarnation still involves a you that survives each death. Over the course of your lives, you change, you develop yourself, or fail to do so. What remains steady across lives is precisely this evolution. But evolution requires a continuity, and continuity requires a you that is continuous. In that sense, although you change over time and lives, it is always you that survives each death and is reincarnated in the next one. One might ask about whether, when you have achieved nirvana, you continue to exist. Since you have stepped off the wheel of samsara, you have stopped evolving. Is there still a you there? This is a difficult question to answer. One might say that a you remains. The you that remains is a you that is at peace, one that has exited the turbulence of this world. It is a perfect you, but a you nonetheless. On the other hand, one could say that you only lasts until your death, and then it disappears, since there is nothing to reincarnate. There are those who study Buddhism who will want to take issue with the interpretation I have offered here. After all, they point out, for Buddhism, the self is a myth. There is no self, only the ever changing process of the cosmos. This is true. All Buddhist doctrine denies the idea of a distinct self. The significance of this denial, though, depends on one's interpretation of Buddhism. For those who do not embrace the doctrine of reincarnation, it is easy to see how there is no self. As we shall see much later with Taoism, one is like a wave on the ocean. There is no distinct self, only a temporary fold of the cosmos that one calls oneself. Things are more complicated with the doctrine of reincarnation, however. If, in a way, the self is an illusion, in another way it is not. As with the Christian doctrine what we discussed, there must be something that survives death in order to get reincarnated. And that something must be continuous with the previous life, or else the nature of one's reincarnation would be entirely arbitrary. We might put the point this way: the self is an illusion that only dissipates when one achieves nirvana. The core analogy between Buddhism and Christianity, as we have discussed them here, could be put this way. In Christianity, one changes over the course of one's life. In Buddhism, one changes over the course of one's life and over the course of one's life. It means it's happening again. In both cases, however, there is a recognizable someone, a you, that does the changing, and which is crucial for you, for our reflection here, that you survives death, either once or many times. You don't cease to exist, and so you, the essence of you, doesn't really die. In Eastern religions, as with the monotheistic tradition, death is ultimately something that is avoided. It's not just that it can be avoided; it is essentially avoided. If we can put it this way, it is unavoidably avoided. Whatever happens to your body or your bodies, you continue to exist. What does this tell us? Why does it matter that in these major world one's own death? It gives us a clue as to the significance and dread of death in human life. If, as the cliche goes, there are no atheists in foxholes, it is because one of the important roles of religion in life is to master the fear of death. This is not, of course, the only role of religion. There are roles of cosmic explanation, of moral guidance, of community membership. Moreover, I'm not taking a stand here on the truth of any particular religion. For the record, I'm an atheist, which is why I don't believe in an afterlife. But on the other hand, I have never been in a foxhole. My point is not to pronounce on the veracity of any or all religions, but rather to call attention to the importance of surviving death that characterizes these major religious traditions. And my point in doing so is to show how important the theme death is in thinking about the shape and status of our lives. The reason for appealing to the religious tradition is that for much of the world's population, religion provides the conceptual framework for thinking about one's life. It is through religion that most people ask the ultimate questions about who they are and where they stand in the larger scheme of things. Therefore, the religious approach to death expresses the aspirations people have in regard to their own death. The fact that common approaches to religions are committed to people surviving their own death tells us both that death is a central theme of life and that it haunts life to the extent that we hope to avoid its finality. Perhaps this is not true for all of us, but it holds for overwhelming majority, even atheists. In this book, we will confront death in its finality. The underlying assumption is that one does not survive one's death. In this sense, we will not appeal to the religious tradition we have just surveyed in order to understand and deal with death. This might raise a question for our project. Many readers of this book are likely to be religious or at least to be open to the possibility of religious truth. Does the approach we take here create an obstacle for thinking about death? Does it make the themes we consider here irrelevant for such readers? I don't think so. When I taught my seminar on death, we operated under the same assumption. I had several students in the course who told me they were religious and believed in an afterlife. They said they were interested in the themes of the course. However, since their faith did not preclude doubt, the course confronted those doubts directly. Even for those who are religious, then, it doesn't seem worthless to reflect on death as a finality rather than as a stage in one's existence. Faith can exist alongside doubt. In that vein, this book might be seen as an attempt to rigorously follow where doubt about an afterlife might lead. Moreover, religious traditions are broad and varied. Even those who believe in some kind of afterlife can have divergent views of how it works and what aspects of oneself may or may not survive one's death. The views we have canvassed here are mainstream ones, but there are plenty of individual variations in the content of faith. I recall once seeing a church in Rome, Santa Maria dell'Orizzone Motte, Saint Mary of Prayer and Death, that had death heads on the doorway and skeletons and themes of death throughout. If any structure was going to put one in confrontation with death, this was it. How about the person who is confident of an afterlife, so confident that doubt does not enter in? He or she is certain of one of the doctrines we have just reviewed, or of something like it. Death for this person elicits no anxiety. The only question for this person is whether he or she is worthy of a good afterlife. For this person, I must admit, the following reflections have little to offer. If death really isn't the end of one's existence, then coming to terms with it as though it were is an empty intellectual exercise. I don't suspect, however, that there are many people who fit this description. On the one hand, for many professed atheists, Blaise Pascal's Vega remains a good bet. Pascal was a French philosopher who wrote that one should act as though God exists, since there is nothing lost in doing so. If God does not exist, but plenty lost in not doing so, so if God does not exist, if God does exist. Just so I suspect that most religious people are not so certain of their faith that it would be pointless to ask about death as though there were no afterlife. We'll be back with the next part soon.